The U.S. presidential election will be here very soon. And of course, here in Canada, we could see a federal election as well because we currently have a minority government. Increasingly, we are hearing concerns about election integrity and potential election fraud. So joining me today from the Crow's Nest Pass area of Alberta is Fred Bradley. And many of you may remember Fred as the former MLA for Pincher Creek from 1975 through 1993. And he also served from 1995 to 2013 as a parliamentary development advisor in Ukraine, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan, which included advising on election integrity. So Fred, great to have you with us today. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Well, thank you very much. Very pleased to join you.
Okay, so Fred, what was your experience like in some of the foreign countries that we mentioned there? And to what degree did they experience attempts to manipulate the elections?
Well, my actual experience was in Ukraine in terms of election monitoring, and I monitored elections in 1998 parliamentary elections, the 2004 presidential election, and the 2012 parliamentary election. And over the period of time, I saw in my initial experience in 1998, there was certainly a lot of manipulation and fraud at the polling stations. Um, but what I witnessed in 2004 during the presidential election was certainly very eye-opening because I monitored the three rounds of the presidential election in 2000 or in 2004, and saw many different types of election fraud during that and manipulation of the vote. When we got to the 2012 parliamentary election, it was basically what we would call a fundamentally free and fair election. The processes, the results of the voting were accurate and portrayed the will of the people. But I saw some interesting things in 1998 in terms at polling stations. Obviously, manipulation by administrative resources being used to back the party of power's candidates in elections, voting irregularities at election polling stations. But 2004 was really the ultimate um, um, experience in monitoring pervasive election fraud conducted by the administration of the political party and the administration presidential administration in Ukraine or their cohorts, and Russian interference was obviously a hallmark of that. I could go into some detail on that if you wanted me to, but there was things like carousel voting where buses would roll up and people would come out and go into polling stations and vote and then go on to another polling station because their names were on multiple lists in multiple different polling stations, and
Wow.
that's how one way of influencing the vote. The other was disappearing ink, where if they knew a polling station was going to vote for an opposition candidate, they would have this disappearing ink pen, and when the ballots went to count, the ballots would would not show the mark for the opposition candidate. And then
Wow.
there was actually in the second round experience where the one constituency we were monitored in, that at the end of the day, the polling commission had got so expert in what they were doing was they just reversed the results. So they reported that their favored candidate, which was the Russian-supported candidate, had won the election. They reversed the votes for the Yushchenko, who ultimately won the presidential election, but they just reversed the votes and filed them accordingly and said this was the result of the vote for this election commission in favor of the uh, Yanukovych versus Yushchenko. So it was really a real eye opener in terms of what can be done. But the use of administrative resources, the election commissions itself, the Central Election Commission, they had 1 million more people vote at the end of the day that than had registered to vote during the election. So they just created all sorts of election. That was absolutely election fraud at a very high scale, which resulted in a third round of voting, the firing of the then Central Election Commission, which had perpetrated the fraud, and then had a fair and free election, um, the third round was absolutely different. They followed the procedures as laid out by the law, and they didn't have the interference that had taken place in the first election. That's basically the experience that I had witnessed in terms of
Interesting.
election fraud.
So corrupt. Now, here in Canada and the US, there's been a lot of attention on foreign interference attempts from nations like China and Russia and Iran, among others. So, what methods are hostile nations using to try to sway election results over here?
Well, there's all sorts of
It's
you know,
gotten
and
more
I'm not an expert.
sophisticated, obviously, than the
Yeah,
disappearing geek, right?
the game has changed
Yeah,
incredibly. Social media is a big part of it.
right.
Manipulating social media, um, fake news and propaganda, um, deep fakes and manipulated media. I mean, hacking into political parties' campaigns. This is happening in the United States, both currently in terms of Democratic and Republican attacks. They can target voting infrastructure. There's just, there's diplomatic and economic pressures that have been used. They can targeting influence operations, manipulation of traditional media sources with putting in wrong data out there, which is then reported, et cetera. So there's many different ways in which foreign actors can interfere in our elections, and then there's actually then they have their espionage and covert operations, and they will also exploit any loopholes they see in our electoral processes if they can do that. So there are many different ways in which that foreign interference and manipulation can take place, and both Russia and China have big actors in that in the United States. Uh, Russia more in the United States, China here in Canada, in terms of the some of the recent things we've seen.
Do we know, Fred, if any of these efforts have actually changed the outcome of an election?
It's really that is really difficult to determine. I mean, in very close targeted ridings, it may have an influence. I mean, there's been those allegations in Canadian elections, particularly, I think, in one in Vancouver. Um, they've manipulated political parties. Have they actually affected the results? That's extremely difficult to assess. In a very close election, I mean, how do you influence public opinion? if you if through social media and influencers you influence public opinion, how do you measure that? How do you actually show that that's had an effect on the results? So that's one aspect. And recently, I think we've seen in the United States uh, where the Russians have just perfected their manipulation, where they actually are paying uh, uh, domestic social media influencers to put forward their propaganda pieces, which they promoted in RT and other sources. So they're actually paying Americans or Canadians uh, to manipulate what is being what the information they want to target to voters in terms of trying to influence an election or
Gosh.
public opinion. I mean,
Yeah.
if you push certain stories which aren't true or there's partially true and just continue to push that with people generally after many periods of receiving information, they start to, even though they may know something is false, becomes part of the psyche of what they believe or what they think is true.
Yeah, that's true. What changes do you think the federal government could put in place to make it a lot more difficult for other nations to interfere?
Well, we currently have a royal commission that's looking into that and was going to provide some advice on that. Um, Obviously, whether it's direct foreign influence by embassies or staff of embassies, I think actions need to be taken. I think the idea of having a foreign registry, I think other countries have it, Great Britain, the United States, Australia, to ensure that these activities, these agents have to register. And 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 maybe and our security services need to be um, perhaps given more resources to uh, to protect our electoral systems against this. Um, Social media, how do you control that? We have the arguments of um, free speech versus actually putting out misinformation and misfacts. That's very difficult to control. Um, and in cybersecurity, I think you have to look at also those aspects. So there's many different ways we can look at it, but it's extremely difficult to um, in this age and with artificial intelligence and the manipulation that can be done there. I mean, we've seen in the United States where
Oh,
there's fake videos out there now
that is
of a
the scariest thing. Like you were saying before, the
of
deep
a of a
fakes.
of a
Yeah.
very prominent musician endorsing
Mhm.
one candidate when she's actually came out and endorsed another candidate publicly last night.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Oh, that is the scariest. Do you think that we need stricter voter verification rules, or, as some argue, would that discourage people from voting? Because you've hear stories of like election poll stations where, like, Elections Canada surveyed election officers during the 2019 Canadian federal election, discovered that what was it, 35% of polling staff sometimes or often encountered individuals asking to vote who were not on the list of electors and who were unable to be registered at the polling station. So should that maybe raise some red flags?
well, we have, I think we have some very good election processes in Canada.
Okay.
The so what happens at polling stations, and maybe this, we used to have an enumeration list where we hire enumerators to go door to door in the first part of when we had longer election periods. So
Mhm.
we decided we had to shorten the election period. There used to be 2 months federal elections because it gave time for hiring enumerators to go door to door to register voters. Those lists would be published. Then people could go to the list and have an opportunity to revise and have their name put on the list. Well, we don't do that anymore. It's compiled electronically based on uh, provincial records or federal records, and they have a list. That list. So we shortened the election campaign to basically a 1 month campaign. Um, so if your name isn't on the list, you have an opportunity prior to the election to have your name added to the list. And you go, it's usually an electronic process. The day of the election, people will show up, and what we require for verification, even you'll get a polling card, I think, from the federal government. But what we require when you go to vote is to show a photo ID, a government issued piece of photo ID with your name and address on it, or two pieces of ID showing your name and address. And that's when people go to the poll, they expect they can go in and vote. They may not have their ID with them that verifies that. So, and their name may not be on the list. And that's where, um, we, you know, that's where the issue comes in. You go to the polling station and you haven't brought your ID with you, and people will say, "I'm not on the list," or "I can't vote because I don't have my ID."
Yeah.
So, those that, and that's pretty strict. I mean, that's pretty strict identification of a
Yeah.
voter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Photo ID or two pieces of government issued or something, a utility bill that has your name and address that proves that you are a resident in the place in which you are voting. Um, and that I think is the cause. But I do think those requirements are very stringent to some degree. That you have to have these two pieces of ID to prove who you are. So it's very. I don't think you have people voting who aren't eligible to vote. It's people who may be disqualified because they can't prove their residency. Uh, does that change the results of an election? I think those. And the other thing, if you don't have that information, if you have a voter, a friend, or someone goes with you who lives in you sign a sworn statement that I live in such and such a address, and you have a neighbor or a friend who comes and signs a sworn statement, yes, I know this person, I verify that they live at this address, they will put you on the list. So I mean that would be access to voting. Do all citizens have um, credible access to voting? And we have all sorts of procedures for absentee voting if you're out of the country, or if you are in a nursing home, or some incapacitated voting opportunities for people.
Right. Oh gosh, it looks like we're out of time here. But Fred, we appreciate you coming on today and sharing your knowledge with us, especially from the voting interference that you experienced in those other countries. So fascinating.
It was certainly a fascinating experience for me and a very interesting period of time in my life.
Absolutely. Fred Bradley is the former Alberta MLA and an overseas parliamentary development advisor.